Hello and welcome back to a Clear and Obvious podcast. It's been a while since our last interview, but we are back with a bang. And always, I'm joined by the brilliant Sam Cole.
Hello, Archie. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, it's awesome. And we've got the brilliant Peter Drury here to join us. Peter, how are you?
Archie, I'm good, thank you. Thank you for having me on your esteemed broadcast.
Glad to hear. Glad to hear. I mean, we might as well get straight into it. Peter, you've had an incredible career as a commentator. We all know that much. We have to get straight into it because something you're so synonymous with is your commentary, your spectacular commentary for THAT Manolas when he scored against Barcelona in the Champions League, overturning a 3-goal deficit.
And they're 10! Roma have risen from their ruins! Manolas, the Greek god in Rome! The unthinkable unfolds before our eyes!
I have to ask, did you plan that?
Archie, in answering that, I'm going to come back with a question. Okay, a Greek centre-half for Roma scored a goal to make up a 3-goal deficit on Barcelona. If I had planned that, how much else the previous night would I have had to plan before that? Is it actually, if you stop and think about it, is it conceivable that there are enough hours in the day to have thought about the possibility that the centre half, probably the least likely goal scorer in the game, was going to score the least likely goal? I'm honestly not trying to be a smart aleck here, but it's just inconceivable that you would have spent time thinking about that in advance. The first time I thought there was even the possibility of this happening, and I thought I'd better prepare to up my game here, was when Roma got to within 1 goal. But do you know what? If they score another goal here, this isn't just any old goal. So no, the short answer is no. I mean, why would you? That simply wasn't going to happen, was it?
Yeah, I guess when you put it like that, it does seem pretty inconceivable that you'd have sat up sort of the night before planning if all, 22 players plus the sub had come on and scored a winner. I guess I just hadn't sort of thought of it like that because it was so almost perfectly put that I always felt like it had to be scripted. I mean, were you aware of the impacts that you'd had with that piece of commentary? Because obviously you watch it back now, and I personally do, and I get goosebumps because your commentary accompanies it more than just the moment itself. How do you feel about that?
Well, listen, it was the day, oddly enough, my planets aligned and sort of the right words appeared to have come out. Actually, do you know, if you listen back to it, it's a load of tosh. I mean, what have Greek gods and hills of Rome got to do with anything? It's just well, the short answer again to your question is no, I didn't, because I'm not on social media. I walked out of the ground. It had been a really exciting night, and we all went and had a beer. And because I'm not on social media, I wasn't aware that it had particularly taken off in any way until my phone started to ring and 1 or 2 people did say, do you know, this thing's gone crazy. And I can honestly say, I promise you, this isn't some sort of false modesty. As I left the ground, it didn't occur to me that I'd done anything above the norm or beyond the norm. It was an exciting goal. I'd got excited about it, and we all moved on. What a lot of people forget is that night Liverpool were playing Manchester City. And so, the game I was doing for a British audience was secondary. And so part of the planets aligning was the fact that people who in their droves had started watching Liverpool Manchester City, as that game died, because it was done, a few turned over, I think, because they heard that, this Roma-Barcelona thing might happen. So I got into the Roma-Barcelona game very, very relaxed, in the knowledge that really only about 3.5 people would probably be watching. And I thought, well, what's to worry about? It's, I'm in the Olympic Stadium, Rome, Messi's playing, who's complaining? And so I was kind of in that mindset, and maybe that lack of inhibition is partly what sort of enabled me to throw off the shackles when that goal went in.
Well, you touched on it there. Obviously, Messi was playing in that game, and when you're commentating on a Barcelona game or any team with, you know, a big name player like Messi, it seems like you almost want to try and build the narrative potentially around them. But that second leg, Messi was pretty poor. How do you adjust your commentary to not build it around Messi? It's got to be quite a struggle.
Well, yeah, actually, that's a good lesson to all commentators of any generation, is not to pre-guess the game. And I mean, you talk about scripting, that would be madness to do in any situation, never mind this, because the game doesn't do what you ask it to do. And so, you've got to be very wary about that. That particular game was actually a very difficult game in any case to pre-guess. What you ask for as a broadcaster or a journalist of any sort is a narrative. And actually, the narrative for that game was fairly unpromising. You know, Barcelona were 3-0 up. If Messi was going to score, it would have been the 4th or 5th in the tie, and it wouldn't have been a remarkable moment, which again plays into the sort of relaxation thing. So, I guess I've never really watched it back in whole, but as a whole, but I would imagine at the start of the game, a way of building it up was simply to say, well, hey, here we go, let's enjoy Messi. And you're right, he didn't play very well that night, didn't play well at all. But as it happened, the way the narrative did unwind, that didn't really seem to matter.
Yeah, fair point.
Let's take it back to the beginning, and where like your commentary career started. How did you get into commentary? Like, was it something you always wanted to do?
Well, it was something, Sam, that I suppose in my sort of boyhood fantasies I dreamt maybe of doing, but only in the sense that every little boy and girl probably does anyway. I never conceived of the idea that it was a serious possibility. You know, like everybody, I grew up kicking a ball around the, you know, park with my brothers and friends and so on. It was pretty obvious I wasn't good enough at playing the game to play it for a living. I, as a child, I did used to commentate on everything. I mean, I've always loved words. And like everybody, I watched football on the telly. And when I was belting the ball into the back of the net, you know, I screamed my own name or the name of whoever the big star player was at the moment. And so yeah, I mean, I love commentating, but it didn't really become a serious thing until my early 20s. I did a little bit of cricket commentary. Then I became a trainee accountant, realised I couldn't do that for life, and came out and sort of started following the dream. And I've had some fortunate breaks along the way.
Yeah. Obviously, players have idols, but is there anyone you look up to or idolise in the world of commentary?
Well, probably my number one idol growing up was a guy who I fear you guys probably aren't old enough to have heard, a fellow called Peter Jones, who was the BBC radio commentator who ran through the sort of 1970s and 80s, commentated on everything actually, but was the main man on a Saturday afternoon football match. Was a Welshman who had a beautiful turn of phrase, who had a lovely lilting voice, and who created a sense of occasion in a very, very special way. Of course, there were the great television commentators of the age, and at that time, of course, it was David Coleman, but it was John Motson and Barry Davis, and on ITV, Brian Moore. Those were the sort of iconic voices of the time. There were others, some very, very good commentators, but those were the well-known ones. But it was an age when television had less of a grip on football. And so most young fans like me, followed it on the radio. And Peter Jones was the superstar name of that time. And I loved him. I was absolutely gripped by his voice and his delivery.
You sort of speak about it there, the fact that radio commentary was massive, obviously, at the time. And if I'm right in saying you were in radio commentary for quite a period of time, how does that? I mean, there's the obvious the person you're commentating to isn't watching the game, but how does the technique for that differ to commentating for television?
It really is, Archie. It's amazing how different it is. And listen, I have to be careful not to be disingenuous here because I profited from this, but it always makes me smile, laugh, that television executives tend to pluck their next commentator from radio, because it's, really it's a very, very different skill set. And almost everyone, in fact, I'd go so far as to say everyone who has moved from radio to television has needed a period of adaptation, because the temptation is always to talk too much. On radio, if you stop talking, that's a bad thing because there ain't nothing else happening. If you talk all the time on television, that's also a bad thing because you just become an irritant. And all of us in television, especially those who come out of radio, have at times been an irritant. And I hold my hand up, I'm sure, I know I have. So effectively, basically what they tell you when you move from radio to television is don't talk unless you can add to the picture, which is a good rule of thumb. If you extended it all the way, you'd actually end up saying more or less nothing, because the pictures, certainly in a very big game, are self-evident. If I commentate on a game between Liverpool and Manchester United, you don't even need me to tell you who the players are. You know them all. So what's the commentator doing there? Apart, if it wasn't kind of a part of your expectation, if it isn't what the generations have created, that on a big game there's a television commentator, I sometimes wonder whether today we'd even bother, because what have I got to tell you about that game that you don't already know? That's the point, really. On the radio, the commentator is self-evidently essential. On the television, he or she is nothing more than what I would call audio wallpaper. You can quite like the wallpaper, or you can hate the wallpaper, or whatever, but the world would go on without the wallpaper. The room would still be there. And I think it's really important for television commentators, and I try to remind myself of this fairly frequently. It's important for television commentators to remember how utterly unimportant we are.
That's quite a grounding way of putting it. So television commentary, though, I mean, it's taking you to World Cups, Champions Leagues. I do want to touch on World Cups because you've been at multiple. Obviously, at the heart of it, you're a football fan, as you sort of touched on when you started off sort of playing football and kicking it about, just like anyone, really. When you're commentating on it, is it tricky to sort of differentiate from being a fan and doing your job? Like, is that above anything else? You're a football fan and you want to try and get your point across and paint them a picture.
Yeah, it's an interesting question, that, because if you talk to different commentators, they'd give you a different answer. I mean, some believe you should try and talk from the point of view of the players, and sort of empathize with the players and see what they're going through. Maybe you might want to talk through the eyes of a coach. You might, I think broadly speaking, though, most would want to feel the game the way a fan feels the game. Because that, let's face it, is the majority of your audience. And that is separate, obviously, from your own fanship. I mean, whether they admit it or not, every commentator somewhere down the line has supported somebody. But I would say to you, on behalf of the whole of our brotherhood, that if you hear, see, or believe anything that says X, Y, or Z is biased, they support X, Y, or Z, don't listen to them, they're rubbish. Honestly, well, you're allowed to think they're rubbish, you can think what you like, but the mindset going into a commentary of a football match is so separate from that of a fan. So you've got it all on, even if you're commentating on the team that you support, that's gone, because you support with your heart and you commentate with your head. And I can promise you that any of the commentators you've ever heard of do not go in with a shade of bias into their commentary, and that is an absolute certainty. So that's one issue. The other issue about being a fan, well, yeah, you hope in the broadest sense that you are to some extent a fan, and that you're enthused by the game the way a fan would be enthused by the game. An example I always give of that is the game that's 0-0 after 75 minutes. And it always irritates me when I hear a commentator or a pundit or whatever say at that sort of stage of a fairly tedious game, oh, this is dull, when's this all going to be over, kind of thing. And I think, well, you can say that, But I know from having sat in the seat in the stand that if I was a fan of one of these clubs with 15 minutes to go, I'm not finding that boring at all, because we might win here. If we get the break, we win. We equally might lose here. If they get the break, they win, and I go home feeling miserable. 0-0 after 75, 80, 85 minutes is not boring. That's not what the fan experience is. You might, as a Fulham fan, Sam, you might be sitting on your seat saying, God, they are rubbish today. I'm fed up with them. I'm sick of Fulham. They've let me down again. But equally, you will know that one just has to fly off someone's knee and you've won the game. And you are excited by that prospect. That pit of the stomach fans feeling exists right to the end of the very worst game. And I think it's quite important for the commentator to remember that.
It's certainly important. I do want to delve a little bit into one specific World Cup, because there's one personal memory that I have of your commentary above anything else. It was the 2010 World Cup in South Africa when Shabalala scores that opening goal for South Africa in South Africa, and you did it perfectly at the time. But and I know this is slightly off piece, but just describe to us the magnitude of that specific moment and how you were able to sort of portray that.
Taylor, what do you say? It's a really good ball. It's Shabalala! Goal! Bafana, Bafana! Goal for South Africa! Goal for all Africa! Jabulila, rejoice! Bafana, Bafana have popped the first cork on their day of days! Sip Shabalala!
Yeah, well, that was my favourite goal. That I can't think that there'll be one that goes past it. That's not self-aggrandizement. I'm not saying it's my favourite goal because of anything I did, but the symbolic relevance of that goal, I think, globally was huge. You know, it was a beautiful day that day, and I can get quite choked up about that day, because that day did what only sport can do. You know, walking up to that wonderful ground in Johannesburg, where people of all shapes and sizes, and most pertinently colours, black and white people, were arm in arm, smiling, united, in a world that for once felt equal, you know, and it was a truly beautiful thing. And when this boy from Soweto belted a wonder goal, it kind of summed the whole thing up like nothing else could. It was gorgeous, you know, it was gorgeous. And so I suppose that was an example of feeling the moment. It was a great moment to feel. And there's no goal I've seen anywhere else that puts the hairs up on the back of my neck quite like that one does.
It was quite something. I mean, because that was, I mean, me and Sam, we were only sort of 19, so that was my first World Cup that I properly remember, and I will forever sort of associate your voice with that Shabalala goal. Just because I do want to ask one more question on it. Just describe the atmosphere and just the uproar in that stadium as that ball ripples into the back of the net, because I mean, it must be quite something.
Yeah, well, it was, and it did feel like a whole, well, you know, it's a sort of self-evident thing to say because it was a World Cup and it was the opening game and everybody was engaged, but it did feel like a whole world moment. And the you know, the identity of the goal scorer was so critical to that. And just, yeah, I mean, the noise was extraordinary. Obviously, we were just learning about vuvuzelas then. But you couldn't even hear the vuvuzelas. Such was the scream of the people. And I say again that the point is that it was such a wonderful moment of unity and, you know, equality. And sport equalizes in the way that politics can't. You know, and here we are 10 and a bit years on and still dealing with issues about all of this stuff. You know, we don't need to go into it here. And it's so mammoth. And yet, if you could just crystallize that moment, if you could bottle that moment and inject it into the world, I think that whole issue would go in a flash. You know, that goal would be our vaccine against inequality and lack of diversity and racism and clumsy language and all of those things, that if we could inject that goal into ourselves now and everything it meant, we'd be okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. We all have our favourite pieces of commentary. For example, as a Fulham fan, mine is from the Europa against Hamburg. Hamburg will host the final. Fulham will play in it. Obviously, delivered with a lot more impetus than that. But what do you feel is the best line you've ever delivered?
That one.
Good, right answer.
No. Listen, Sam, honestly, it's a very difficult question to answer that, because it kind of implies self-congratulation, and I don't want to go down that road. And I say again, I honestly think we're just wallpaper, and it's not really important what I've said. But actually, you know, looking back, those are the nice moments. Forgive me, I know Fulham hates being patronised, but Fulham is a really lovely club. Nobody hates Fulham, you know, and because they don't do anybody any harm. They play on a beautiful ground in a beautiful location, and there's some sort of soul about Fulham. And I would categorise them with other clubs like that. And actually, I get a lot of satisfaction if I hear from a fan like yourself that, in some sense, for a club that is outside of the kind of big brash showbiz world, I've managed to tap into the way the supporters felt in a very special moment. And I know it was 10 years since that Fulham game this year, and I did a little few bits and pieces with Fulham commemorating that famous semi-final, which they say, some might argue, you know, was Craven Cottage's greatest night. It really gives me satisfaction to know that for the Fulham fans, I appear to get it right. So that is lovely. I would say that I did the very last game at Old Wembley was a playoff final won by Ipswich. And one of the greatest compliments ever paid to me, it was on ITV, the highlights. It had been live on Sky, ITV had the highlights. And one of the greatest compliments ever paid to me, not deliberately, was that the next day, the Ipswich local paper, its centre page spread, just printed my commentary word for word all the way through, right up to the presentation of the trophy to the Ipswich captain. And I thought, well, that is Ipswich. You know, that is a one-club town. It's not Manchester United, Liverpool, Manchester City, but my God, that club matters to the people of Ipswich. And if the people of Ipswich like what I said, that'll do for me. So those are the ones, the non-league clubs that beat league clubs. You know, when Histon beat Leeds in an FA Cup tie in pouring rain on a cabbage patch of a non-league pitch, and the postman scored the goal. You know, and the people of Histon remember it. Or when Barrow won a trophy final at Wembley. You know, those are the ones that you think, wow, if they were happy, that'll do.
Yeah, the real underdog stories. Yeah. So you came in at a point where Brian Moore left ITV. So you'd have been considered at that time the new generation of commentators. How would you say that the new generation of commentators, so the people coming now, i.e. the Sam Matterfaces, how do you think they're different from your era, per se?
Do you know, I've never really thought that through. Clearly, social media has become a big deal, and maybe that generation would be more reactive to, certainly engaged with social media. I guess that is a step forward, or otherwise, depending on your perception of social media. I think basically the same broadcasting rules of grammar apply, and the same rules of engagement will always apply, and that is to say that some will like you and some won't like you, and I'll like some and I won't, you know, think others are quite as good. You certainly wouldn't expect me to go into names and faces now, because I wouldn't expect fellow commentators to offer a particular critique on me. But the game's essentially the same, and so is broadcasting on it, and people's tastes ebb and flow. And as a commentator, 1 month you might be flavour of the month, and 1 month you might be the one who's having bricks thrown at the screen, you know. So that doesn't alter. I guess, of course, I mean, listen, if you listen to the commentators back in the 1960s and 70s, the way people commentate has changed, but it didn't change overnight. It's just evolved over a period of time, and I'm sure it'll continue to evolve.
You sort of speak about kind of the way that obviously commentary's changing, but something that never changes is having a co-commentator. Yourself, you've been partnering with Jim Beglin for, I mean, ages. You've been with him for ages, and it's an unbelievable partnership that you two have built. How important is that dynamic to be able to sort of paint a picture when you're commentating? And are they sort of almost there to kind of keep you in check?
Yeah, they are. They are. I think that's a very good point. They are there to keep you in check. I always say this, and hear me through to the end of this sentence. It is my opinion that it is not the job of the commentator, me, to have an opinion. Now, like you guys, of course, I could have an opinion, do have an opinion on players, teams, issues, but I'm just there to articulate the football match. The point of having the co-commentator is to have an expert who has played that football match, who has played or coached at the very highest level, and who is able to feel it in a way that a non-player can't, and who is able to offer an opinion which has depth, has the gravitas that only experience brings. So again, it frustrates me when I hear a commentator, listen, obviously during the course of a commentary, I might say great ball or fabulous goal. And in a sense, that's an opinion, but it's a fairly facile opinion. When it comes to the depth, to the reading of the game, if I hear a commentator offering a critique, I think, well, okay, fair enough, you can think that, but I'd much rather hear what the guy sat next to you is saying, because he's been there and done it. And I think that's what the co-commentator is there for. The job of the commentator is to say who's got the ball, where they've got the ball, and to sort of decorate that basic information with the context and the facts that go around it. The job of the co-commentator is to say why that happened, how that happened, to interpret. And if you work with a co-commentator who understands that distinction, and you both respect each other, each respect each other's roles, I think you've got the makings of a decent combination.
Certainly. I know you're a busy man, Peter. So we won't keep you for long. Just one more question, if that's all good.
Of course.
So obviously, right now we're in a period where no fans around the stadiums. That much is pretty obvious. How does commentary change? Because obviously, as a commentator, you're looking to kind of play off and feed off the fans in some way. You sort of, comment on, if a particular away set of fans being a bit rowdy. How does that sort of change your kind of angle on it?
Well, very sadly, Archie, we've started to get used to it now, which is, goodness me. If we've learned one thing over the course of this horrendous period, it is how much we should value the fans. Because although we're getting away with it at the moment, unfortunately, the football is quite exciting and the narrative in the Premier League is good. If it goes on, we can't keep pretending. In a sense, at the moment, we're pretending, and I don't. Nobody should apologise for that. That's what we have to do. When it first began, there was a sort of conversation going on amongst us about, how do we deal with the absence of noise? The reason, if you trace it back, the reason the commentator raises his or her voice when a ball goes in the net is because 40,000 other people are, and you're shouting above them. And if those 40,000 other people aren't there, why are you shouting? But then you say, so if Mitrovic scores the 91st minute winner for Fulham, and it went in, you said, Mitrovic has scored and Fulham won 1-0. I think as a Fulham fan, you'd be a bit disappointed by that. You still need to build the moment, and I think it's just become accepted that that's how you do it. Oddly enough, in the early weeks, one thing that struck me was the possibility that the players could hear you. At any given football match in the Premier League or at fairly high level, they're probably, with radio and the various television networks, there are probably 4, 5, 6 different commentators. all raising their voices. And, you know, there are points when some commentators are quiet and others. I did a game towards the back end of last season at Watford. Watford against Newcastle, which will only be memorable to probably fans of those clubs and those around Watford in the relegation zone. And Watford won that game from behind by 2 Troy Deeney penalties. And which at the time seemed to give them a route to salvation. You know, it was a massive win that got them above the line and so on. And as Troy Deeney was behind the match-winning penalty, about to run up to it, I paused and I heard another commentator sort of 15 yards away from me giving it the full, you know, and this is the biggest kick of the season. If Deeney puts this away, and I'm thinking, and his was the only voice I could hear in the whole stadium. And I thought, if I can hear this, Troy Deeney can hear this. And it made me wonder, is the pressure greater when you've got, well, at Watford, 20,000 fans, you know, bearing down on you, hissing, booing, cheering, whatever, just on the edge of their seats, desperate for you to score or miss, or to hear one voice in the stadium simply in plain English telling you that if you miss this penalty, it's a disaster. And I did wonder whether in that moment Troy Deeney could hear that commentator. And so listen, that could all be spurious. I think the players have got better things to do than wonder whether they can hear the commentator. But it is weird when your voice is echoing around an empty ground. And my goodness me, I honestly think, because I'm a sentimental uncle, I honestly think when I next commentate in a ground with tens of thousands of people swaying and singing and shouting, I think I will struggle not to choke up because, my goodness me, we're missing it.
Peter, thank you very much for joining us. It's been an absolute pleasure. And yeah, thank you for joining us.
Archie, Sam, really good to talk to you. Good luck to you and thank you very much for having me on.
Thank you very much.